But testimonial injustice harms us all. It predisposes us to disbelieve people who are historically disempowered or marginalized, and it enables us to believe the powerful because we associate them with virtue in some way. Credibility deficits don't just happen on an individual level, though. If it were only an individual problem, then we could simply root out the prejudiced individuals and the problem would be fixed. But like all of our prejudices, there's a structural component to epistemic injustice. Fricker calls this communal or structural component hermeneutical injustice, which means it's a type of injustice that has to do with meaning making or interpretation. I like to think of it as shut out of the storytelling injustice. Hermeneutical injustice happens when a marginalized group is excluded from the social process of meaning making and therefore lack the words, the concepts, the interpretive tools to explain their experiences to others or even to understand these experiences themselves. Fricker terms this a gap in collective understanding that exists because of the relative powerlessness or isolation of the people experiencing that situation. So like, the best example that literally just came to me in the hotel when I was going over this was the Me Too movement, right? All of these people had been having these experiences, and it wasn't until Me Too, Me Too, Me Too, Me Too sort of took over, after Tarana Burke coined it, took over the Twitter, to make visible the ubiquity of sexual harassment in women's lives. I have two other examples of it as well. Domestic violence. Domestic violence and or marital rape was inconceivable, in that it was inconceivable that it would constitute a crime. When men were charged with making and interpreting laws, and women weren't viewed as human beings, but as possessions, you cannot imagine that something like intimate partner violence would be criminal activity. The criminalization of domestic violence took a long time and was helped along very much not just by women's activism, though that was important, but by the invention of the Polaroid camera, which allowed women to retain evidence of bruises and other signs of violence to kind of keep in the back of their closets for when they were ready to come forward with their stories. They had physical evidence to show. Intimate partner violence remains ubiquitous but underreported. Advocacy organizations estimate that 35% of women and 25% of men experience some sort of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. The number is higher for college students. Indiana ranks 6th, I think, in the nation of states with intimate partner violence prosecutions. The prevalence of sexual assault on college campuses, as we know, is staggering. And the dearth of prosecutions for these crimes is equally astonishing. Only since the advent of consciousness-raising groups in second-wave feminism and subsequent have women been able to come together and recognize those, oh yeah, right? Judith Plaskow calls them those yeah moments that she had at Yale, right? Sitting around and being like, yeah, that guy did that to me too. Yeah, that professor ignores me too. Yeah. And those moments made their marriages, their work lives, their college experiences intelligible to them for the first time. Right? That is sort of the undoing of hermeneutical injustice. More frighteningly, women's exclusion from social meaning-making affected our understanding of the institution of marriage. Historically, and even sacramentally to some extent, marriage was understood as a contract providing a safe haven for male lust, like a garage, as a place where men could satisfy their sexual urges. This meant that the concept of unwanted sexual contact, which we have a word for, it's rape, within a marriage was inconceivable. It was the woman's obligation to provide her husband with sex. It was even colloquially known as the marital debt. If it's framed as a debt, then refusing to pay is the crime, not collecting the debt. Marital rape was not criminalized in all 50 states until 1993, the year I read Schneider's Madeleva Lecture. Marital rape was rarely considered possible before the 1970s. It is a hermeneutical injustice because the way women were taught to talk about marriage and to think about marriage included this blanket willingness to engage in sex. There was not room in the story for being coerced or worse. Consent was not part of the discussion because it was assumed in the I do of the story. That story, we now know, was too narrow because the story was created without women's input. Even women couldn't conceptualize marital rape because the paradigm of marriage relegated them to objects for men's fulfillment. And if that phrase sounds familiar, we read the same theologians. A religious example of hermeneutical injustice, of the unimaginability of a ubiquitous experience, is available to us in the work of Judith Plaskow, one of my predecessors at Manhattan College. She's a Jewish feminist theologian. She writes that halakhic codes, such as Deuteronomy 22:28, dictated that the punishment for a man raping a virgin was financial restitution to the woman's father and also the rapist agreeing to marry her. Plaskow asks how it is possible that the punishment for rape be that a woman gets to marry her rapist. And the answer, of course, is that the law was elaborated entirely from the perspective of men. Only someone who is treating women as possession and not as a human being would view that as a just punishment for the rapist and not a complete trauma for the survivor. The only way that story is plausible is if women are not people but property. The story of what marriage was, what sex was, what women were, was too narrow. By excluding women from the community of meaning-making and sense-making, lawmakers, ancient and modern, blinded themselves to the reality of women's bodily integrity and dignity.